Hi everyone. In this short presentation I'm going to talk through one of the theories of distance learning that can have a significant impact on issues of presence that we've been talking about this week, and that's what's called transactional distance, as you can see on the slide next to me. It was the development really of a researcher called Michael Moore in the early 1970s who looked at traditional distance learning and correspondence courses at the time to see how this distance, this physical distance between tutors and students has an effect on the learning and the learning outcomes in any one particular program or course. He wrote a seminal paper in 1973, which is the one that I've put here, and it's in the Journal of Higher Education and Towards a Theory of Independent Learning and Teaching. And it really introduced this whole notion of not just the physical distance in distance learning, but the cognitive and communication distances that can also be a big issue as well. So does it have a definition, and what is it? Well, it does, yeah. Moore defined it this way. It's had several definitions, but Moore defined it this way: a psychological and communication space to be crossed, a space of potential misunderstanding between the inputs of instructor and those of the learner. And it has these three main components that you can see here: the dialogue, or the communication that goes on between the tutor and the students, and the students and the students; the structure of the learning, the structure of the program, of the learning experiences, of the support mechanisms, all of those structures that support learning; and the autonomy and control that students have over how they learn and what they learn. And it's those three dimensions really that we're going to look at in this little presentation about how that affects the notion of transactional distance. So the important thing to say is that it's not about the transactional physical space. It's not about how far apart the tutor and the students are physically. It's about how far apart they are transactionally in terms of learning transaction. It's also true to say that this is equally important in classroom situations, and it may be that in classrooms you can have students who are physically sitting there but transactionally may as well be anywhere in terms of what they're understanding and in terms of how the communication and the learning processes and transactions are actually working. So let's take a look at how transactional distance is affected by the first two of those issues, structure and dialogue. And that's what this chart does here. It shows how, as it says, the variables of dialogue and structure determine transactional distance, and it can be shown fairly simply in a graph like this. As you can see, we have structure on the y-axis and dialogue on the x-axis. As you can see, I've borrowed this from an American presentation, which is why there's no UE on the end of dialogue. But you can see that the more structure that we have, the greater the structure and the less dialogue that we tend to have. So the transactional distance tends to increase. It tends to be that the highly structured courses with very little communication and dialogue going on between them means that the sense of distance, particularly the cognitive sense of distance, tends to be at its greatest. No great surprise, I guess. And conversely, the less structure we have and the more dialogue we have, then the closer the transactional distance feels to be. And the trick really is to try to get that transactional distance to feel as small as it can do. And as I say, that is true both in distance learning courses and it's also true in attended courses as well. There is a third issue here, a third dimension here, the capacity for individualization, which Moore has put on this y-axis together with structure. And again, no great surprises. The more capacity there is for individualization, in other words, the more individual a student feels, the more they feel they're being communicated with as an individual, then the shorter the transactional distance, and the less they feel that, the wider, the bigger the transactional distance. What Moore then did, and again we have to remember this was in the early 1970s, but what Moore then did is look at the way in which technologies, and it's a very broad definition of technologies because it includes written books, but that's fair enough, typical programs by technology used and how that affects the transactional distance. You can see here that at this time in particular, the closest transactional distance was achieved through independent study on campus, so not at a distance at all, actually. It was where students are on the campus, where they have personal tutors and personal tutorials, and they have this sense of close dialogue and control over how they learn, when they learn. The individualised telephone correspondence was the next one. Individualised correspondence teaching, group telephone and group correspondence. You can see all of these here. And you can see that they are increasing structure, and therefore they do tend to increase the transactional distance. But in general, the dialogue is pretty much the same. However they correspond, there's a lot of dialogue going on. The courses that had bigger problems with wider transactional distances, and therefore problems for the students in terms of their learning, were the ones that used more distant types of technology, and in fact at that time used technologies much more. So we have computer-aided assisted instruction here, dial access, audio tapes, TV and radio, which are completely unpersonalised, and the textbook, the self-directed independent reading. A lot of correspondence courses, a lot of distance courses, particularly in the 1970s, were very much this type, this textbook type, where you were posted a book and a reader that told you what to do with those books, and then you read through them, and the learning was really kind of down to you, guided very much at a distance. What I think it's interesting to ask now is, with virtual worlds, where do you think virtual worlds might lie in this graph? I mean, because we use them in similar ways, I suppose, or we can use them in similar ways to classroom teaching, does that mean that we can put them right down here? Are they as good as independent study on campus? Or because they have different characteristics of communication, because we can't pick up verbal clues or visual clues quite so easily in virtual world communications, might we put them a bit further along the dialogue, the reducing dialogue axis? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think you can probably argue for them to be in quite a few different places on here. What I'd like you to do, though, is to have a think about that during this week, and we'll pick it up in our tutorial next week in Second Life, and we'll discuss about how virtual world technologies can affect this notion of increasing transactional distance the more you tend to use communication technologies, which is certainly the conclusion that you can draw from this chart. I'll put this whole PowerPoint presentation in the resources folder for this week, so please do take a look at it. Take a look particularly at this slide and just have a think about where you think virtual world technologies might put us on this kind of chart. This one's a bit more difficult to get your head around. It's the attempt to try and look at how autonomy in learning fits in all of this. So if you take that graph that we had just previously and you turn it on its side, which is what Maura's done here, so you've still got structure and dialogue along Y and X axes, but you can see that as the transactional distance is increasing, and that's the transactional distance, whoops, get the right pen, the transactional distance is increasing here, so the autonomy that's required from the student tends to increase, and as it says, the level of autonomy required of the learner increases as transactional distance increases. So we need to know our students. We need to know who it is we're designing curricula for. We need to know where they're going to be physically, where they're going to be cognitively and mentally, and where they're going to be on a continuum of their ability to take control of their own learning. As you know, in the UK, if you start a degree, you start at level 1. In the second year, you go into level 2, and the third year, you're in level 3. And the differences between those levels are very much about building that kind of autonomy in the students. So at level 1, we don't really expect a huge amount of autonomy. Mostly at level 1, for undergrad programs, students have come out of school where they've not been given enormous amounts of autonomy. Even in sixth forms, they're not given huge amounts of autonomy. And so we want to try to encourage that. But obviously, the greater the transactional distance, attended or distance, the greater the autonomy is that's required of the student. This looks horrible when you first look at it. But actually, if you unpick it, it's actually quite an interesting diagram to look at. As you can see in this top right corner, there are three dimensions really to autonomy. The first of those is establishing goals. By how much can the students decide what they're going to learn, what the learning outcomes are, how they're going to learn it. The second one is executing the learning program. So how much autonomy do they have over how they learn and where they learn, and what resources do they use and how do they use them. And the third of those is how much autonomy they have over the evaluating process. In other words, the way in which examinations and evaluations and assessments are carried out. So there are those three dimensions. And the cube that you can see on the diagram here is trying to look at the way in which those different dimensions have an effect on the kinds of autonomy that students can develop. The rarest form of autonomy, excuse me, is the number 6 one here, the autonomy only in evaluation, and that is very rare. In fact, any autonomy in evaluation and assessment isn't common, and that's partly a function of university quality control requirements. That it would be ideal in some ways if students could decide how they were going to be assessed and assess themselves. And we do formatively encourage students to assess themselves, and that is good course design. But in summative assessment, we really do have to have some form of quality control that ensures that it's fair, that it's comparable across cohorts and comparable across years. So it's kind of understandable that autonomy can be difficult to establish. The autonomy in execution is probably the most common situation. We probably do give students the greatest leeway and the greatest autonomy in how they're going to learn. Having said that, you could argue that traditionally we don't do that very much, because if students have to learn by attending a classroom, and that is really the only way that they're going to have access at least to the knowledge, whether or not they learn in a classroom is a different notion, but at least they have access to people who have the knowledge and access to each other. If classrooms are the only way that they can do that, I'd argue there's not a very great deal of autonomy in those models. The third one is autonomy in goals, in setting goals, and that is quite uncommon. Again, it tends to be that the learning outcomes for a course are predetermined, and that again tends to be the result of requiring quality control. So, what does all this mean for curriculum design? Well, fairly straightforward really. When autonomy is low, the need for structure is high. When structure is low, the need for autonomy is high. Duh. Programs with low dialogue require a higher degree of learner autonomy, but programs with low dialogue and low structure require an even higher degree of learner autonomy. And that is the point really. The point is about knowing our students, about knowing the situations that they're going to be in when they do their learning, and about what kinds of support we're going to need to give the students for the kind of autonomy we expect them to develop. And it's particularly true at a distance. That notion of support, that sense of belonging, that sense of being part, all closes the transactional distance for distance learning students, and it's a very important issue. So, lastly, as course designers, we can develop very highly structured courses with little room for learner autonomy, if we want to, or we can develop very unstructured courses allowing learners to exercise a high degree of autonomy, or we can do it anywhere in between. The thing that matters is knowing what we want to try and achieve, what we want the students particularly to try to achieve, who those students are, where they are physically, where they are mentally, where they are even emotionally and cognitively, and designing courses that fit those kinds of requirements to try to keep that transactional distance as short as we possibly can. So that's all I really want to say. I have based this presentation on a paper that was given in October 2006 at the European Distance Education Network by Alan Stover. So just a thank you to Alan for making his presentation publicly available. The presentation itself is very much longer, has a lot more detail in it, but those graphs that I showed you are based upon his work, and I think they're really very helpful. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.